Right, hello, greetings, hi, it's Thomas Daffern here for my monthly philosophical address, on the state of the world. I was doing this every week for good on 2 years, but I've slowed down. Events in the world are moving so fast. I'm so busy on many fronts, I thought I'll do this once a month. So this is my March talk, and it's March 27th today, 2022, and I'm looking at world events that have been happening, trying to give a kind of philosophical perspective on it as I see it as a peace philosopher, and I'm going to be, touching on what's been happening and maybe suggesting ways out of this crisis. The last talk I did was on the 20th of February, and that was 4 days before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And so I'm going to start by talking about this invasion, which took a lot of people by surprise, shock, etc. Because although intelligence had been warning that they were picking up signals, this is what Russia was planning, I don't think anybody in their right mind thought, Putin would actually invade a sovereign, independent country in a massive way. That sort of action just is so against international norms, against international law, that I thought Putin was cleverer than that. I thought he was intelligent. I've always given some leeway to Putin. I know Russia. I have friends in Russia. I've visited Moscow for congresses of philosophers and so on. So it hadn't occurred to me that Russia had slipped so far into this alternative narrative whereby an invasion like this could actually be ordered. So in the last month since then, I've been deeply researching the history of Russian intellectual life, political life in the last 20 years. I was in Moscow in 1990 and 1993 as a philosopher, working at the University of London. I'd launched the Institute for Peace Studies and Global Philosophy. I was teaching peace studies at the University of London and specialising in comparative interfaith studies for peace. I was also Secretary General of the World Conference on Religion and Peace, and so I had my finger on the pulse of all that stuff, and I thought Russia was part of the same project. I thought Russia was also committed to peace and finding a new international order at the end of the Cold War. I was researching my PhD at the time, which was about the search for peace from 1945 to 2001, and I thought that we'd got there with the Treaty of Paris in 1990 and the end of the Cold War in Europe. I thought that was genuine. And what I hadn't realised, and I opposed, of course, the kind of Western adventurism that used 2001 to launch its wars on the Middle East. I've written a history of the events of 9/11. I think the conventional narrative promoted by Bush and Blair was totally suspect. I don't think the truth has ever come out about who was really behind those events. And I've called for a historical commission of inquiry, which I've set up, and that's ongoing as I suspend judgment. But I know that the conventional history was not given, and instead it was weaponized and used as an excuse for the Iraq invasion in 2003. Now, that was totally illegal in my view, and in the view of 2 million other people that marched for peace in London. And we were all appalled that this search for non-existent weapons of mass destruction would lead to a complete catastrophic invasion of an independent country. Saddam Hussein was not a particularly cuddly kind of chap, and he had many enemies. He was very, very difficult to his own people, many of them. But on the other hand, Iraq was an advanced society. It had freedom of speech within certain limits. It had intellectual freedom, academia, and so on. It was a liberal or socialist attempt to build a kind of Arab socialism. And I think it was wrong to invade it and destroy all that and unleash the forces of hell, which were the extremist kind of Wahhabi-inspired kind of Islam, which is utterly different to the kind that the Baghdad Enlightenment of before the Mongol invasion stood for. I mean, I'm with the old school of Islamic thinkers that believe in tolerance, freedom of speech as being a hallmark of true Islam, which is spiritual surrender to the truth, to the absolute, not something forced on you. And I've put all this in my commentary on the Quran. So it set back the clock that those wars and the attack on Afghanistan as well by America, aided by Britain and so on. Now this all began with the false narrative of 9/11, which is why it's so important we retrieve and recover and do an archaeology of all that. And whereas other people are focusing on the materials evidence, showing that the official narrative cannot be true because of materials, building science, architecture, engineering, fine. Richard Gage and so on have done tremendous work. I'm focusing on the intellectual architecture of what might have been behind that, which countries. Anyway, so I think Russia developed a suspicion of the West during the 2000s. I think Putin watched these invasions in the Middle East and thought, what on earth are they doing? How can they justify this in international law? I think it shocked Russian intellectuals to see the West so cavalier in its disdain for international law. I mean, if Russia had evidence of what happened on 9/11, if they actually knew or had some kind of evidence, then they should have come forward with it. And, it should have been put on the table. It's interesting that one of the researchers into the history, I think he's called Thierry Meyssan, a French scholar who was skeptical like me of the 9/11 official story. He was on a discussion group this week organised by Richard Gage, very interesting, on the Pentagon, which again, there's many suspicious signs that the Pentagon story cannot be factual. The plane hitting and it was driven by this gang of terrorists and so on. There's a lot of weird evidence about what was going on in the Pentagon. Now this Thierry Meyssan says he was informed by the chap who was acting head of Russia's entire defence forces on 9/11, General Ivanov, I think he's called, that the Russians had evidence that a missile had been fired at the Pentagon from a ship offshore, an American ship. No real evidence has been put forward for that. But it's interesting that Russia, claims that. This guy, General Ivanov, is not a fan of Putin, apparently. He's now part of the opposition. I'd love for him to give evidence to the 9/11 Truth History Commission, which I've chaired, and which meets on 9/11 each year. So, and if this chap Thierry Meyssan wants to give evidence, then that would be great. We're trying to look at this historically, in as much depth as possible. But anyway, I suspend judgment on that. What I don't think, however, is legitimate is for Russia to say, oh, well, we don't like the West, we don't trust what they've done in the Middle East, we think they faked 9/11, we think they're a rogue, bunch of people that justify their own military adventures, but won't let us have any. I don't think that's an excuse or an argument for then Russia to say, oh, well, let's go and clobber our nearest neighbour, Ukraine, let's just invade, disregard all international law. That argument doesn't work. That's like, two wrongs don't make a right. What we should be doing is deconstructing the legitimacy of these Western imperialist adventures in the Middle East and saying, no, these were not fair, they were not just, they were not right. What we should be doing is building together Russia and the West and America and Europe, a a proper peace architecture for the Middle East and for the wider Europe. And that's what I've been calling for the last, since 2008, when I travelled through the Balkans from Greece up to Venice. And I had a sort of premonition that there would be trouble in Ukraine. I had a sort of, premonition is the only thing I can say, a sort of druid flash. And I got very active in trying to persuade the European Union to set up a mediation service for conflicts that would break out on the frontiers of Europe. I was very inspired by visiting the Doge's palace in Venice with this gnawing feeling in my heart that trouble's brewing in Ukraine and Russia. And I looked at the Doge's palace in Venice, where they kind of ruled the world from Venice with their merchants. They had detailed maps on the walls of the Caspian Sea, of the coasts of Alaska, of Canada, of all of Central Asia, all the way to China, the entire Atlantic. The merchants of Venice were incredibly, like they had their finger on the pulse of the entire world, actually. And I was thinking, look, if just one little city-state from Western Europe could do all this, and of course they got tremendous wealth, which they then devoted to the arts, to Venice becoming the most beautiful city in the world. And I've listened to Vivaldi concerts in the church where he was the choir master, played by candlelight. Venice is one of my favourite cities in the world, and with their fabulous wealth, they devoted it to the arts, to music, to literature and philosophy, and esoteric stuff. Some of the great esoteric Christians of European intellectual history had links to Venice. Paolo Sarpi is one. And I was in Venice at the World Conference on Religion and Peace. We had a big interfaith gathering in Venice. So it seemed to me that surely we could have an a European Union mediation service, maybe based in Venice, why not? Which would then give advice to countries around the world on the borders of Europe, which we can interpret as being the borders of the whole Mediterranean region and the Atlantic. I mean, that's a European littoral, so to say. And I proposed that and wrote to the Secretary General, the authorities in the European Union. And a couple of years later, they won the Nobel Prize for Peace. But unfortunately, the European Union still didn't set up what I asked for, which is an actual, robust, legally binding mediation service, so that if any conflicts broke out on the edge of Europe, that service would go in and mediate them. And it would do so independently of any political pressure from different countries in Europe. It would be like a firefighting agency that would have a duty to go and put these fires out. I mean, when there's a fire in downtown New York and the fire station is rung, the local politicians don't ring the fire station and say, oh, maybe you shouldn't do it, or no, it's their duty. They just go and put it out. So we should have a European Union mediation service that would immediately go and put these fires out. And they may well be, others. It's not too late to do this. This is a far-seeing, long-term project, which, the European Union is a very successful thing. I love it. I live here. I live in France. I sneaked in just before the horrible Brexit nonsense took off. I genuinely want my country, the UK, to rejoin the European Union. I love the project of a united Europe, that we can all travel and work and study, and I can go and teach in Germany or France or Spain or Britain. I want Britain to come back in as soon as possible. I'll come to that in a minute, because okay, so now this Ukraine thing's blown up. It's my worst nightmare. I saw this coming in 2008. My voice wasn't listened to. My advice has not been adhered to by the British government, because my institute, which should be a practicing part of the University of London, a federal institute in Bloomsbury, it should have a budget of, commensurate with that. It should have meetings going on in Parliament on peace policy. It should be able to bring and attract the greatest researchers into peace from all over the world. that was kiboshed, it was blocked, it was stopped, it was silenced, by short-sighted, ignorant, intelligent stroke conservative politicians who have this sort of fear of peace. They assume that peace is a kind of leftist thing, as if we don't know what Stalin got up to. That's absurd. Peace is the agonising attempt to solve conflict before it breaks out, and once it's broken out, the agonising attempt to stop it as soon as possible. It is like firefighting, and it was Sir William Beveridge that founded Senate House, where I studied and taught. And Beveridge was a liberal, in fact, like I am. And so it's not a right thing. Peace doesn't belong to the rightists or the leftists. It's an attempt to bridge that gap of discourse. So I'm very much within the Beveridge tradition intellectually. And I still would like us to bequeath a Institute of Peace Research to the British people in London as part of the Federal University of London. It's the least we can do, because it's so obvious the lack of intelligence in Britain. I watched in horror. Boris Johnson to me is the epitome of anti-intellectualism. It's a fake intellectual. His posturing and his fake classicism. The man is a woeful exhibition of what Eton and Oxford turn out these days, which is people that just literally, okay, they may be clever, they may be able to quote Latin verse, but they haven't got a moral sense. This man Johnson has no morality in him. He has self-interest, egotism, and self-promotion. And he's attracted around him a coterie of people like Priti Patel, Rishi Sunak, who are the same. They have no fundamental decency or morality, but instead just promote their own egotistical ends and selfish oligarchical ends. We have a functioning oligarchical plutocracy in Britain now, which has seized control of the Conservative Party. How did this happen? How was it allowed? This is, you see, my view is that the battle for the soul of Ukraine, which is going on, begins in Londongrad. It has to start with a very deep re-examination of British history over the last 20 years. What have we been doing in Britain? Why have we not pursued a genuine peace path since 1990, when we signed the Treaty of Paris? Why did we become a sort of apologist for American military capitalism and its adventures? Why did we not challenge the narrative of 9/11 right from the beginning, as I proposed pretty early on? Why have we not used what little bit of international credibility we had to try and push for a genuine peace settlement in the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, two-state solution? We could have done it. I'm reading a biography of Netanyahu at the moment, a critical biography by a historian at University College, in depth, and his ability to exploit, right-wing fears of the settler movement and to egg on that sort of right-wing voice in Israel as if peace is a threat. You see, if peace is organised properly, it's not a threat to anyone. It's only if we get peace and then there are some bullies left out there in the street with Kalashnikovs or whatever, then it's a problem. But that's why we need a security as part of peace. So there had to be, and there has to be, a way whereby the people of Israel and Palestine can live in peace together with two proud, independent, wonderful states. I have friends who are Israeli, friends who are Palestinian, amazing people. It should have been part of Britain's karma to actually help bring that to be. I still maintain we should be doing that. But now we have a war in Ukraine. What? Where did this madness come from? So I've had a huge light shed on this by reading in the last month since we last spoke a very, very important historical study by Professor Timothy Snyder of Yale University, a historian in my own kind of club, should we say. I did my PhD on the history of the Cold War, the search for peace, but I ended in 2001, and I thought that we'd got peace in Europe. I thought Russia was now part of the civilized team of nations. I mean, I've been in constant contact with Russian intellectuals since. I thought they were on the same hymn sheet. What I've learned from reading Timothy Snyder is that's not the case. There's something very, very tragic actually happened in Russia over the last 15 years, 20 years, which I'm now bringing myself up to speed on. And essentially what's happened is that Russia under Putin took an anti-European turn, an anti-democratic turn, and invented a whole new kind of ideology for itself called Eurasianism. And he's been under the spell of pseudo-intellectuals, pseudo-philosophers who've spouted a kind of anti-Western, anti-liberal ideology, which is really akin to a sort of Russian form of fascism. And it has all the hallmarks of fascism, which I've studied in great depth, in the history of political ideas, which I did as part of my degree in London, obviously. Now, the chief thinker behind this is a guy called Ivan Ilyin, who was a Russian philosopher, intellectual, who'd done a PhD. He was a Hegelian. He was a clever man, undoubtedly. And when the revolution happened in Russia in 1917, he was eventually thrown out of Russia by Lenin on the famous philosopher's ship, which exiled a couple of hundred Russian great thinkers, intellectuals, which was, pretty good. Lenin could have just killed them all, but he let them go, because he was trying to sort of establish Bolshevism as an intellectually credible movement. He didn't want to just mass slaughter the intellectuals. So Ilyin went abroad. He went to live in Europe. He eventually settled in Switzerland. Unfortunately, his thought took a much darker turn, and he drifted to the far right. He ended up as an apologist for Hitler, Mussolini, because he was saying, like Evola and other right-wing thinkers, that these warriors need to stand up to Stalin, because they knew what Stalin was up to and that he was doing dreadful things. And they wanted to, support the right wing in Europe that was prepared to fight him. But Ilyin's thought took a kind of sinister turn in that he then took on the thinking of fascism as the ultimate truth, and that he became an extreme anti-liberal. He thought, I don't know, I haven't gone into his archives, but whether he was aware of the Auschwitz and the destruction of the Jewish population. I mean, he did take an anti-Semitic route, as did many of these white Russians, fascists, supporting Hitler. He wasn't the only one. Rosenberg, who became the philosopher of fascism and Nazism, the myth of the 20th century, he was from the same stable. He was from one of the Baltic states, and he fled at the time of the revolution. And a lot of these white Russians were more right-wing than Genghis Khan, and they were what were egging on Hitler to take his extremist position. And it was fueled with fantasies of, the blonde Aryan hero, the Nazi hero who will defeat the horrible evil Slavs, and the Jews. It's all fantasy stuff. It's like Game of Thrones in a dark dungeon kind of mentality. It's sadomasochism in history. And I don't follow that line. As a fan of Beveridge and the middle way of peace politics, I think those extremist ideas are dangerous. And I'm very upset to see that they've become dominant in Russia. I mean, what? I'm reading Timothy Snyder, I'm thinking, what? Have I fallen down a funny rabbit hole here? But no, this is the worldview of Alexander Dugin and Putin. They believe they are the heroic fighters who are going to fight and destroy evil European civilization. They've psyched themselves up, probably during the pandemic. I don't think Putin's been out much talking to normal people. He's in an information bubble, and he's psyched himself up into this we Russians, we're the last heroic stand of civilization against these evil Westerners with their evil Starbucks and their evil credit cards and their evil... oh yeah, homosexuality is absolutely verboten in Putin's worldview. It's like the decadence of disgraceful and horrible evil. And no, we're all strong men here. We're all great heterosexuals. We're going to fight for the rights of the family and smash these evil people. Now, it's interesting because Rosenberg took the same view in that he hated Athens, and his myth of the 20th century is a diatribe against the corruption of Athens. Well, okay, so I'm a fan of Athens. I'm a philosopher. Pericles, to me, is, you know, a great man in his defence of freedom and democracy, and his oration is one of the pearls of all world literature for the Athenian dead. If you've not read it, it's in Thucydides. You know, I'm a fan of Herodotus. He got me to be a historian. I fell in love with history by reading Herodotus, who read his book out loud to the Athenian intelligentsia of his day. I'm a fan of Aspasia, of Miletus, the other great city to die for, where, you know, Aspasia was a beauty and an amazing intellectual woman. You know, Athenian society was highly sophisticated and to die for. And Plato's works, which I've read entirely, I'm a kind of Neoplatonist in my philosophy. I mean, what's not to love about that? And yet this man Rosenberg, this semi-educated white Russian emigre fascist supporting Hitler, wants to smash all that. These people are semi-educated, they are barbarians. And now Dugin and their coteries, Putin and so on, they're all spouting the same nonsense. They want to destroy democracy, they want to destroy the West, they want to destroy Europe. In the name of what? Okay, so what's the ideology that has justified Putin's invasion of Ukraine? It's called Eurasianism. And, you know, go away and study it. Read Timothy Snyder's incredible, important book, The Road to Unfreedom. Eurasianism is a weird distortion of history. It's saying that all of Europe is corrupt. You know, the European Union is the devil's brew. It's satanic. Only we, Moscow, the fourth Rome, are the genuine inheritors of anything that was good in European civilization, because we've not lost our masculinity and our strength. And the reason for that is because we were actually taken over and run indirectly by the Mongols. And the Mongols are God's gift to humanity, because they were tough, they were cruel. And we Russians, now the Eurasians, are following on from these Mongols, and we're going to just smash these Europeans and their pathetic little Ukraine and their pathetic France and so on. So, you know, I mean, I'm reading this stuff and I'm thinking, golly gosh, these poor people have not studied world history properly. You know, they're being fed a distorted view. Anyone that promotes the Mongols as a kind of, you know, God's gift to history needs to read about the slaughters they did. I mean, they sacked Baghdad. When the Mongols took a city, they used to like massacre everyone in there and pile the heads up in a great big pyramid outside. You know, 60 feet tall, a pyramid of skulls, which then turned into like skulls bleached in the wind and rain. And that was the Mongols had been. You know, if that's what Russia hopes to do with Kiev, oh, the Mongols sacked Kiev, by the way, and did that. They did the skull thing. They burned all the churches in the 1200s. I mean, the people of Ukraine know what Mongols are like, and they know that. So, I mean, it's like history is repeating itself karmically. It's like, oh God, the Mongols are back with their Z tanks coming at us. And it's just very interesting as an intellectual historian of War and Peace to see how these memes come up. So yes, Putin and his coterie are taken over by this Eurasianism, which promotes Mongol-type warfare as the solution to everything. God, you know, I really feel sorry for these, because these are not the Russians I know and love. I mean, I have deep, deep friends and, you know, respect to the true Russian soul. That's not that. This is a coterie, a cabal that's taken over the running of Russia, and it needs to be opposed by the democratic peace voices inside Russia itself. The Russia I know and love is the Russia of Tolstoy and Pushkin and Turgenev and the Decembrists and the liberal tradition in Russia. It's the intellectuals I met in 1990 when I went to a conference on World Philosophy for Peace, and I was elected coordinator of Philosophers of Peace. The people there, these intellectuals working at the Institute of Philosophy, who I'm still in touch with, like Professor Chumakov and others, I mean, they're the true soul of Russia. They're proper intellectuals. They're not pro-Mongol apologists who are going to promote, attacking other nations in the name of this fantasy called Eurasianism. So read Timothy Snyder. You'll be brought up to speed of why Russia's actually, no, it's not Russia, why Putin's cabal has launched this evil and ignorant and illegal war against Ukraine. I see it as the third phase of a threefold attack on the West, because this has not just come out of nowhere. What I've realised, I mean, I've been working on this, as you know, fasting every Sunday for the last 2 years, trying to understand what on earth is going on in world history. Initially with Brexit, which I saw as such a ridiculous and stupid and evil move by a certain cabal in Britain. Now I've been joining the dots in the last month, and I can now announce officially, just you hear it here, maybe for the first time, because this is not on the British media, except maybe Byline Times is doing the work. Peter Jukes is joining these dots, and there are a few others. The war on Ukraine is phase 3 in a long campaign by Russia. And I don't mean the real Russia, I mean the Putin cabal Russia, in its attack on the West and on Europe and on democracy. Phase 1 was Brexit. And if all the evidence that's come out, Chris Wiley's book on the Mind FCK, and Carol Cadwallader's work, I hope she has time to write a whole book about what she's been through, her exposure of what's been going on. Timothy Snyder explains this in great detail. We now know that the campaign, Vote Leave, was run by stooges working for Putin. And I mean, Dominic Cummings had spent time in Russia absorbing that sort of Putin-esque worldview that you disregard all law and you just go for power. He was supported by Aaron Banks, who had Russian money, and all that sort of oligarchical cabal were put into power at the behest of Putin and his minders. Lebedev, Alexander Lebedev was a senior Russian KGB operative working with that whole Putin worldview. In fact, Lebedev Senior had appointed Putin to his position of authority within the Russian state and groomed him to take over when Yeltsin was going to step down. Yeltsin had problems with alcoholism, so Alexander Lebedev spotted young Putin, a young man from Petersburg, and said, okay, he'll do. So Putin was a sort of front man for the Russian intelligence establishment, and he was doing that job reasonably well until now he's gone completely bonkers, and he's now acting against the interests of actual Russian civilization. And so the problem is, well, what do you do with that? How do you deal with that? I'll come back to that in a minute. So then, okay, so we know that Vote Leave and the other pro-Brexit lobbies were campaigning for